Okay, Natalia, I'm so pumped you're here because we get to talk about your new book, which I think is going to be amazing. Comes out in January now, right?
That's right, January 6th.
So, why did you start writing this book? What was the kind of genesis of the reason why you wanted to write this book?
Yeah, so the book's general idea is about the place of fitness in American life. And I wrote it because fitness has a huge place in my life. And I wanted to figure out kind of how that happened. And when I say a huge place in my life and in like American culture, I mean that in really, really good ways. Like, I love nothing more than being in the gym and getting that sweat and feeling those endorphins and my gym friends, etc. But on the other hand, there's a lot of not so great stuff that goes on at the
Mm-hmm.
gym too, in terms of body image and kind of exclusivity and all that. So I wanted to figure out, like, how did we become a country that's obsessed with working out as a good thing, even though it's more complicated than that, and also where access to exercise is definitely not universal. So that kind of got me on this train.
Well, when I started thinking about this book, I can't wait to read it, honestly, because I've been
Me
reading a
too.
lot of fitness based books. My last one was Daniel Lieberman's Exercised, excellent book. Dr. Lieberman,
Totally.
incredible.
Great
And it
book.
made me think of that with this in the historical aspect. And he talks about the biological and anthropological beginnings of exercise. I'm curious about the fitness history that you discuss related to that.
Yeah. I'm glad you start with that book, which I think is a great book as well. And so it's really interesting because when you tell someone you're writing a fitness book, like the first thing they assume that it's like a how-to book, like, oh, flat abs in seven
Yeah, let's
days. And
get
I'm
fit.
like,
Come on.
yeah, I'm like, well, I am an instructor, but
Yeah.
like that's not this book. And so the other kind of fitness book that people presume, especially when I say I have a PhD and I'm a professor, is that I'm like a movement scientist, right? Or like an exercise physiologist. And there's a lot of great work that comes out of those fields too. But people are like, when I say I'm a historian, they're like, wait, what? Like, that's an interesting perspective from which to take up fitness. And really, like, my expertise is American politics and culture, American society. And so what this book does is it goes back to a time when working out was weird. I think my first section is called When Sweating Was Strange. And if you were someone who went to the gym, if you could find one, because there weren't that many, like, people thought you were suspicious. It was a strange thing to do with your time. So it goes back to that. It starts in like 1893, actually, with like the strong men on stage who are posing with their muscles, and people are like, ooh, let me touch that. Like, who, look at this freak of nature who works out all day. And it gets us all the way up to the pandemic and Peloton and really looking at the future.
Wow, I love that the history of fitness is interesting to me because I mean you could even take it so much further back into very ancient history
Yeah.
through and Roman times with that. I've done some of that. It's crazy.
So that's actually, I want to point that out. So I'm a historian of like contemporary America.
Mhm.
Like, what is contemporary? It could be today, it could be the
Yeah.
last 100 years. But you're right. When you're thinking about things from a kind of like evolutionary perspective, or even like what historians call longue durée, like the long
Hmm.
duration of history,
Yeah.
yeah, you can go back to ancient times and look at how the body has evolved from hunting and gathering. And like from that perspective, you can go back to the Greeks, as many people do, and
Exactly.
look at like the Greek gymnasiums and the kind of notion of like mind and body connectedness. That history is all super important. But, as a historian, we kind of have to like pick our period and
Of
what we're
course.
focusing on. And what's interesting is that even though in those terms, I look at a relatively short period of time, which is like the 1890s until today, like the book's 450 pages long almost,
Yeah. Right.
because there's so much and so much has changed. And so I think the benefit of having that like closer look than going back centuries and centuries is like it's full of human stories. It's full of like the stories of people who created those studios, who said, hey, exercise is actually good for you. Because there was a whole medical establishment being like, do not run. You're going to get a heart attack. You're going to
Sure.
die.
Yeah.
Ladies, your uterus is going to fall out if you lift anything heavy, for real.
Yeah.
And so I tell all those stories in there, and having that kind of closer perspective and not trying to cover 500 years or thousands of years allows me, I think, to really bring it to life.
Let's have you answer a big question. We're gonna do a
Let's
big
do it.
question here, all right? Because this
Nice.
I think should be this I think encapsulates a lot of what you're talking about, but also we're searching for the answer to this question, I think, in our business is how do you grapple with the obsession with exercise? However, with the low percentage of people that are actually exercising regularly, there's an obsession, but on the other side, not so much in terms of it.
So
How do you
true.
grapple with that?
Yeah. And so one of the things is when I say obsession, sure, I mean people who are working out like crazy all the time,
Right.
but I also mean much more relevantly to most people, like the obsession with the idea we should work out, but
Mm,
very few people, like 80% of Americans, don't
exactly.
work out. So the first thing I would say from a business perspective is that one thing I've heard again and again in interviewing entrepreneurs and quite successful ones is something your listeners might already know, which is like, we're not competing with the other fitness device or the other studio, we're competing with the couch. And so because there's so many more people who don't exercise at all, like you
Right.
don't need to capture the market share of people who are at another gym. You need to get people who don't work out at all. And so I think one thing that's important for that is really considering the accessibility and like relatively low barrier to entry that you need to have to get people in the door, because it can be hard for folks like you and me who like really feel at home in the gym to remember how intimidating it is. Like
Right.
one thing that comes across in the book, and I think it's gotten a little bit better, but that I found is like, it is so prevalent that people feel like I need to be fit to go to the gym. Like I'm embarrassed to walk in there. It's intimidating. And I think sometimes the fitness industry really perpetuates that, because what are they selling? Who's on the like marquee outside?
That's right.
Ripped people who are young and hot and, looking conventionally fit. I'm sorry if like I am not someone who's comfortable in those spaces. That's not going to get me in the door. So I think that's important. And that might seem obvious, but I do think it's a little bit of a risk for some fitness businesses, because like, if you look too accessible or you look like the place where people who might not look super fit and young hang out, is that going to hurt you with other consumers? Well, I would say it's worth it. One, from like an ethical perspective, but even from a business
From a
perspective,
business, yeah.
yeah, like, and so I think that's super important. The other piece, though, I think is actually bigger than any one entrepreneur, and that's really like a policy issue. So one of the things that I focus on a lot is this crazy paradox in America where the fitness industry has grown and grown and grown and grown and grown, and now is even like rebounding from the pandemic. But our investment in physical education, in public recreation, running trails, basketball courts, pools, all of that reflects inequality. Like you go to an affluent neighborhood, oh, green space and parks and tennis courts and all these things. You go to some neighborhoods that are not so affluent. The reason people aren't working out isn't because they're lazy. It's because it's dangerous to go outside,
It's dangerous.
or
Yes.
the way that their work schedule is structured. They have to commute super far and they have a shift that's overnight and they can't bring it into their schedule. So that can seem discouraging, but I think it's actually really should be inspiring that we should be organizing to say, hey, let's invest in like really good PE. Let's get streetlights in the city parks. Let's, advocate for jobs to make incentives for people to actually exercise and have the time to do that.
I mean, there's a whole bunch there to discuss that I've discussed with a lot of people, but I want to talk about specifically when you're researching to do this book, what surprised you about the information that you found out?
So many cool surprises. But one thing that surprised me is that, because it's a history book, like I spend a decent amount of time looking at the moment when like our modern industry really exploded, which was really like the 80s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
that is when you start getting all these gyms and studios. And I won't even tell you what I assumed. I'll tell you what I found out. One thing that I found out in interviewing a whole bunch of people who really hit it big in that moment is that, yes, they're amazing entrepreneurs and they're creative and whatnot. And I expected that, but they pretty much all were very aware of the fact that the accident of the timing of their birth created huge opportunities for them. And what I heard again and again is, can you imagine if I'd been born 10 years earlier, I would have been a PE teacher. And
Mm,
that versions of that comment come up
mm.
again and again. To me, that's actually a really sad comment, because
Yeah.
like, oh, it would be so great if all this talent went into physical education. But actually, and so like we can just put that out there for people to think about. But it is really fascinating that for a lot of people, especially women who were like jocks and like always athletic, like they really felt like their only track was to be a PE teacher, which sadly, even within the education profession, doesn't get a ton of respect, doesn't earn a lot of money.
Yeah.
And then these same people, because they graduated from college in like 1982 or 1983, were like, oh my God, in 3 years, I was like making VHS tapes and going teaching on fitness cruises. And these are the folks who became like some of the biggest names that created the industry today. And so I was really surprised at like the prevalence of that. And then the other thing I was surprised about, because once I heard that, I'm like, oh, okay, so you guys made the decision to go make money. And, that is understandable, but it doesn't feel like this idealistic thing. But one interview really opened my eyes to something, which is, you'll have to read the book and see who it is. But one guy who's still around and very famous in the fitness industry today told me, the reason he was a PE teacher and a coach and he left to go work in the private industry. And he's like, you know why I did that? Because in PE, I saw that the kids who were already athletic were the ones who were playing. The kids who needed it most and could benefit most were making up excuses and sitting on the sidelines. And like the curriculum I was teaching actually wasn't motivating them or inspiring them to move and to get like this joy out of exercise. And then he said when he went to go work in the studio world, he actually found that he could create an inclusive experience in another way where women were working out, moms and daughters. And he said, like, I actually felt like I could do more good work in the industry versus in public education. That totally surprised me and really made me reflect on like, we've got to think about inclusivity in lots of different ways. Like I can glorify, oh, if only PE was perfect, but PE has never been perfect. Like there's a reason, And so that was kind of a really interesting surprise. And it brought together, I'm really tracing in the book, in part these two things, like the rise and not exactly fall, but plateauing and a little bit of decline of enthusiasm for physical education and the rise of the fitness industry. And those stories and those interviews, I totally didn't expect. And those really brought those together, I think, in a really meaningful way.
That is actually really interesting, that kind of the change with that one going up, one going down. And now we stand where we're currently at, this digital age of health and fitness with it. But I wonder what it says about our obsession about exercise. What does that say about us as a society in your point of view?
Yes. I think, Americans are really obsessed with individualism and kind of this idea of like the self-made man or woman, and fitness fits so perfectly into that, right? Because even though I spend a lot of the book saying it's not just about individual motivation, like there is something about exercise, which like, what do you need? Well, you need a lot of things, but one thing you definitely need is like individual motivation and willpower. And if you have that, the mythology goes, you can transform yourself completely. And you have the visible evidence of that transformation on your body. That is very, very American.
True.
So is the fact that as much fun as we have at the gym, and I like to have in the gym, so is the fact that fitness is work. And Americans are very into the idea that like this Protestant work ethic, that like if you work hard, it pays off. And if you work, like working hard is a virtue. And so I think that there's that too. And that kind of speaks to why historically fitness has become like, has been such an American, like people in America have become so enthusiastic about it. I'll also say that all of America, it's obviously not the same. There's lots of regional variation here.
Yeah.
But one thing that's been really interesting to me, like I lived in France for a while, and the book is about the US, but I try to like make nods to other countries. It's so interesting the way like the California beach body gets exported, and the way that particularly like this whole like mid-century romance of California as being the place of like sunshine and health and beautiful bodies and all of that, that really gets marketed all over the world. And so you see like they're like Russian video companies that are making videos with like a set that looks like LA. And the idea is like, I mean, all these countries have their own fitness cultures, but there's something super appealing about like the American style of exercise that becomes an export.
The American style of exercise. That's funny. Totally. What about, I thought about this association too, and I think you may have spoken about this, kind of the rise of kind of your fitness guru in the history of fitness and wellness, and almost that you talked about individualism, but also in that someone who rises to an elevated experience creates a community, and that could feel almost like a cult within fitness.
Totally. And so another thing that I trace in these 400 plus pages is the place of yoga in the United States as it relates to fitness culture. And there've been yoga cultures in America like since the 19th century. For much of American history, these kind of spiritual communities were not really about physical movement, and they were kind of like apart from fitness culture. That starts to change in like the 60s and really changes a lot in the 1990s when you start seeing like yoga classes, yoga fusion classes in like every gym, right? So that is relevant to your question, because one thing that I found that's fascinating is that fitness instructors, which isn't even like a real profession until the 1980s or 1990s, are like mostly considered like kind of like body mechanics, right? These are people who go and they tell you step touch and they say, if you want to get your biceps bigger, do this, or, your waist slimmer, do this, but they're not invested with very much cultural or professional respect. When you get to the 1990s and you have this fusion of yoga and fitness, that like really starts to change. And you start to have fitness instructors be invested with this authority of like being a guru. Oh, this is my therapist. This is my life coach. This is my sex icon. This is my
Yeah,
DJ, like all of these things. And a lot of that language actually comes from yoga. And you hear instructors change the way they talk. It's not about like 50 leg lifts to thin those thighs. It's like reach in, find your deepest self, and
that's right.
that kind of
Yeah,
talk.
yeah.
And, I think some of that I think is great, because I think fitness teaching is like really important work. And I think it's like wonderful that there's a more explicit language to talk about that power. But something that I've written and spoken about somewhat is that, fitness profession, the fitness profession is still relatively unregulated. And so there are a lot of individual fitness instructors who are invested with a lot of that power, right? Like people look to them for all kinds of advice and guidance. And unlike being a doctor or a nurse or a lawyer, like there are not really professional guidelines of what you can and cannot do. And we've seen, quite a few examples of like pretty crazy boundary crossing that goes on in those environments. And so I think, I'm not like taking a harsh stand on that in terms of like what I think should happen or who's at fault there, because I don't think it's always like a good guy, bad guy situation. But I think we're at a point in our culture where we, for lots of good reasons, kind of see the fitness instructor as like a powerful figure, but we don't really have like language or
Yeah.
regulations or anything to kind of like manage that power or know how to navigate it, I guess is a better way to say it.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting about this conversation, I think will be powerful for a lot of fitness professionals. A lot of fitness professionals going to hear this is they don't often know the history of their own profession.
Yeah.
And that's what's, I think, is critical, is to understand what you're actually in, where it comes from. I mean, we're a very infancy based, formalized profession,
Totally.
but highly unregulated. So, through the history of what you've learned, what are some of the better things we've done through the history to increase the awareness of fitness? And maybe what are, on the opposite side, what are some of the things that we haven't done well in our infancy?
I'll take one theme to answer both of those. And what that
Okay.
is like the issue of expertise, right? On the one hand, like it's actually been amazing to see this profession become formed really in the last, like as a profession, like 40 to 50
Right.
years. I mean, it's really in the 1980s that you start getting these organizations like the American Council on Exercise.
Mm-hmm.
It was called AFA. Now IDEA. It
Yeah.
used to be dance exercise, but
Yeah.
all those like acronym associations, those all came about in like the 1980s. To put that in perspective, like the American Medical Association, American Historical Association, those are from like the 1890s and early
Right.
1900s. So a really new profession. So a really good thing that I've seen, because it's such a new profession, is that it had low barriers to entry. So you had all kinds of like marginalized people who were able to really become pioneers in that. Like the people I interview in this book, these are women, these are queer people, these are people of color who, because what you needed was like charisma, good choreography, and like, to a certain extent, like an attractive body and like some hustle. And those are the people who were really laying the foundation for this industry. And many of them did very well. That is night and day from some more established professions where, oh, you need to get in the door. Oh, you need to pay this licensing fee. Oh, you don't look the part. Oh, you need to get into the school, right? And so that I think is really beautiful. And I try to highlight how valuable it can be to have those kind of porous boundaries because you really get incredible creativity. Now, the downside of that dynamic is kind of what I was talking about before, which is that there's a lot of totally unregulated advice out there that existed certainly at the early days of the profession, when I couldn't believe, looking at some of the documents that I include in the book, of like, they would say, like, it would be like in a magazine, like, oh, like, how do you know if this is a safe movement? And it would be like, go up and ask the instructor, is this a safe movement? Like, to the consumer, like, it's not even like telling, like, putting the responsibility on the instructor. So, there's issues for injury, et cetera. But I think today the problem has gotten almost even worse because with social media, like, anybody who looks the part and has good lighting and is charismatic can amass an enormous following. And I think that that is problematic, and almost more problematic than it used to be, because the scale is so enormous, right? And I also think, like, this has always been the case in fitness, but image is so important that I think there's always been this huge problem that just because you have a six pack and your biceps look amazing, people think like, oh, well, their program is right for me. And people feel empowered to share that. And that I think is crazy. Like, every time I go online and I see somebody who's sharing their program based on like my journey, and I'm like, great, I'm glad that's your journey, but that's like not an MD, or like, I'm like happy to hear your story, but that is not expertise. And so I think that that is a real problem here. So, to sum that up, on the one hand, so awesome that people can get into this and really make moves. And that's been one of the best things about this industry. On the other hand, oh my God, it's like the Wild West, and anybody can offer advice. And that is something we need to be super careful about.
Let's do a hypothetical here.
Let's do it.
I just 100 years from now, right? A historian like yourself writes about fitness in the 21st century. What do you think they're going to write about? What will the history of the 21st century of fitness potentially be?
History of the future, right?
Yeah.
Historians famously hate counterfactuals and hate predicting the future. And you're giving me like two of these at once. Well, I think, to cheat a little bit, since we're already in 2022, I think the big story of these 20 years that we've lived in is the story of digital fitness, connected fitness, just becoming a huge part of our fitness environment. That's not going to go away. That's going to get even more intense and even better. I mean, now, like, VR fitness, I think, is still like sort of niche, but I imagine that is going to get like bigger and bigger. It's interesting though. I personally think we're going to see a continuation of in-person brick and mortar fitness continuing. And that's because we've even seen so far that, like, as so many other things we do go online, being in your body with other people and in person, like, means something. It means something more than like shopping for toilet paper or for some people, even worship, quite honestly. Like, the gym has continued to be this kind of holdout where people feel like there's something special to show up for in person. My hunch is that as even more things in our life go virtual, there will still be some kind of persistent in-person fitness space. My hunch is those in-person fitness experiences, though, are going to be more special. Like, you're not going to do that every day, because you're not going to be like, oh, I go to the gym every day, because you're going to have such a good tech remote setup that you could do 3 or 4 of your workouts a week at home, and it's going to be pretty good. But the day you go, maybe you travel somewhere, maybe the workout's an hour and a half. Maybe there's like more of like a deliberate social surrounding to it. Like, I think it'll be more of a destination. Those are some things I would say. I would love to say that I don't know if this is going to happen, but that we will reinvest in public space and public fitness environments. And I do think we are at such a crisis point with health in this country, and especially in the pandemic, like, our institutions have been so just like convulsed, that I think the positive outcome of that could be a kind of wake up call of like, hey, we've got to invest in more of these safer, safe, and welcoming spaces for people to exercise. So I'd like to think that that's part of our history of the future, but not making any promises, although let me make some policy and I'll help make it happen.
Yeah, it's good. I think it's great to talk about the past, and it's great to talk about the future.
Yep.
But speaking of the present, I would love your take on how the pandemic affected the essential nature of fitness, or non-essential nature as was deemed by a lot of people or organizations. Give me your take on that.
Oh my. Well, the pandemic dealt such a body blow to the fitness industry,
Yeah.
of course. Like the fact that all of these environments, all of these businesses were shut down and people lost their work, of course, and people couldn't attend them. I think it had so many repercussions that we're still dealing with today, both in terms of the livelihoods of business owners and employees, but also in terms of those lost communities of people who would go to these places. We are seeing a rebound of in-person fitness. So I
Yep.
think that that is good. But I think what's the effect of the pandemic? Well, we know the bodily and mental health effects have been quite bad. And that I think is absolutely connected to people having less access to exercise and to exercise community. No question about that. I do think, to be slightly more optimistic, that for so many people, the pandemic like stripped away so many aspects of their quote unquote normal life and forced them to really reflect on like what they want and what's important. And I think that fitness is really part of that reflection process. So it's been interesting to me that people bought their Pelotons or their home kettlebells,
Yeah.
and I did all those things too, that like some folks realized like, okay, wow, I really need to make fitness a deliberate part of my life. Cause right now my life is happening in these four walls. And if I don't like get up and move on purpose, it's not happening. And so you saw some people reconnecting in that way. Then there are other people who I've seen like who bought the whole remote setup and they're like, oh my gosh, like the reason that I like to work out wasn't even the calorie burn. It was, yeah, sure that, but it was seeing other people and going
Yeah.
out and so I think that it's almost like when you're on like an elimination diet and then you introduce things back in and you really realize what your reaction to them is. I
Hmm.
see that a little bit with fitness too. And I think people are kind of like recalibrating and thinking about what's important and how they're going to act. And for some people, I do think a lot of people are going to hang on to their remote setups for a long time because it's just so
Yeah.
convenient. A lot of people also made real investments in that, like more than a Peloton, outfitting rooms, home
Yeah.
gyms, etc. So they have new habits and they've made investment in it. But I think another thing that's super important, because I'm so obsessed with like fitness and inequality, is like, my God, yet another thing that exacerbates inequality in our country. Like, let's not worry just about the closed gym. Let's worry about the closed park, about the basketball hoops that were taken down. And when people are like, oh, just work out at home, who has more space to work out at home? Like,
Right.
it's just the communities that don't have that are already the ones that are more affected by diabetes, obesity, food insecurity, all these things. And so it's like, my God, like we had in some ways, like I roll my eyes when people say COVID was the great equalizer. Absolutely not. It was the great unequalizer. And we see that very much in terms of fitness and like the very uneven way that this like, oh, just stay home or just work out at home or, the way that was experienced. And I think fitness is no exception to that.
Yeah. I mean, for some people, it was a much easier thing to do than other people. I mean, and
Totally.
especially like work from home. There's a whole conversation related to that and inequality for that.
Mm-hmm.
But in many ways, I'm writing an article about this.
Cool.
In many ways, it was another inflection point in the fitness industry
Yeah.
because it made people, especially the consumer, also realize that fitness is more than just maybe the physical and nutritional aspect of things. It's like, wow, sometimes you don't realize the power of something till you don't have that power anymore. And you go,
Oh,
maybe it's good for my
absolutely.
mental health. I didn't really associate this with my mental health. I associated this with having a nice body,
That's right.
those type of
And
things.
Yeah. And you realize like the nice body is nice, but so is seeing people. I mean, there's a sociological concept called the third place. Are you familiar with that
I
term?
am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for if listeners, if you're not like, so the idea is like there's home and there's work, and then there are third places. And it's not like being out in the street. They are places where you have kind of happenstance interactions, where you find community, where you go by choice often and you find meaning. And I think the gym is absolutely that kind of third place. Like if you think about it, you go there and sure, maybe you like deliberately meet a friend to work out, or you have the same people you train with there every time. But when I think at the height of the pandemic, when I was thinking about what I missed about exercise, I mean, honestly, some of it was like that chat in the 3 minutes before class starts, or like the person in the locker room who you're, that sounds sleazy, but like the person in the locker room
Hey, let's
who,
not get creepy here, Natalia.
who you're chatting with, because you just happen to be like at the mirror at the same time or whatever. And like all of that kind of like casual interaction, it doesn't only happen at the gym, but I think exactly as you're saying, like we sometimes have such a transactional view of what exercise is for. It's like to make sure I don't get a heart attack, to burn this number of calories, to get this goal weight. But actually the pandemic, I think, made so many people realize it's about so much more.
It is about so much more. And I think this has also given rise to kind of this social wellness club that now you're seeing in places like New York City and LA. This thing's just like, hey, it's more than just exercise. It's like, hey, we're coming here to purposely be social. We're going to have different drips of IV of different products and things. I mean, it's a whole bunch of stuff. It's kind of the whole wellness has taken over in many ways. It's been good and bad because wellness is so vague and it's often
wellness.
undefined.
That's absolutely. And like one of the lines in my book, I think is something like wellness is ubiquitous, but like poorly defined. And we don't really know like what it means exactly. But I think, this notion that mind and body are connected and that it's up to individuals to kind of take an active role in their health, and especially in preventative health, that kind of encapsulates a lot of wellness practices. And yeah, it's absolutely why you see like, oh, there's a boot camp workout, and after there's these IV drips, and there's a green juice bar right over there, and and it's and like there's a massage place it's offering a discount, and like all of that is connected. The other piece of that, which I find interesting because I think it kind of makes sense, but it kind of doesn't sometimes too, is the connection to the beauty industry. And I always find it like fascinating. Like, you'll see in the book, like that in the early 20th century, in the mid 20th century, even like in some ways, it was easy to sell fitness to women, not as sports, because like girls and ladies weren't supposed to do sports, but as another beauty product. And so you would have like essentially these things you would now look at as kind of like early fitness studios, and they were attached to beauty salons. And it was like gentle exercise, but it was like you would get your nails and hair done and you do this exercise. Totally different from like what you would consider like a CrossFit studio or a CrossFit box or, anything more rigorous. Now, though, you do see, especially with some of the more women's oriented fitness studios, it's like workout and blowout bar or like facials. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I do think it's interesting to see that reconnection of the beauty and the fitness industry again. And it also begs this question that you've been posing, I think, in a lot of our conversation, which is like, why do we exercise, And I think pairing the beauty industry and the fitness industry reminds us that for a lot of people, like we still want to look pretty, right? That is one reason.
There's a central tenet to that.
Yeah. And I think that, just to go back to your first question about like, what is it? How as a fitness industry person, do you like get people in the door to your class? I think one thing, which is like kind of complicated or interesting to grapple with, is that if you've made fitness your life, you probably connect to exercise as something more than about superficial appearance, right? Like you're in it for like really deeper reasons. But what's important to remember, but not totally make the center of your program, is that a lot of people start working out because they want to lose 10 pounds, And I think that's actually really hard in the fitness industry because on the one hand, you don't want to participate in this like gross diet industry thing of like shaming people for their weight and acting like that's the purpose of exercise. Because of course we know just exercise is not going to take off the weight.
Poor mechanism for weight loss.
Exactly. But that's the way this industry has sold itself for so long. And so I think that like, I really respect all the fitness industry people who are like resisting that, or like, I am not going to like promise your miracle body or anything like that. On the other hand, I can't count the number of people, including myself, who pretty much started exercising because they wanted to like lose some weight. And so I think that trajectory, if I came for the weight loss and stayed for the community, the strength, all of that is very, very common. And so I think it's a real challenge for folks in the industry to figure out like what's the right marketing blend that recognizes that weight loss is an important goal for some people, but doesn't over determine it in a way that just perpetuates the same old terrible diet industry messages of decades and decades.
Oh, it's true, because most people, I've been training for 22 years, and most people come because they want to lose weight.
Yeah.
And then I have to explain to them, okay, we need to educate you about this. This is not the mechanism for you to have primary weight loss for that.
Right.
But it's such a constant issue that people still believe that exercise is the main way to lose weight.
Yeah.
And we have to grapple with that, but also understand that people are aesthetic beings.
That's right. Like
They're
think
aesthetic
it's really,
beings.
yeah, I think we care about how we look.
We just do.
Nobody should feel ashamed of that, you know? And I think, you know, there's a lot of talk about this in like the kind of body positive community where, you know, it's like a huge deal to move from like basically self-hatred to body positivity. But then a lot of folks were like, well, you know, you're kind of like shaming people if they're not positive about their bodies when it's really freaking hard to be positive about your body, like in this environment. And so people talk now about like body neutrality, which, you know, emphasizes like maybe trying to do the radical thing of not staking your whole self-worth on like what you look like. Like it's okay to be like, my body is what it is, but it's not my whole self-image. But it's hard. We are aesthetic beings. We want to look good. I want to be a certain size, like, you know, and I think one kind of tip, not that you're asking me for tips, but like one thing I have found through this research and also just being like a human working out for also like, you know, over 20 years is like, we shouldn't deny that appearance is important to us, but I think it's important to be self-aware about how important it really is to how you feel about yourself. And then the next piece, which I think is so important, is we have to be so vigilant about rejecting all of the moral language around appearance and weight. Because I think particularly for women, but for men too, like you hear this everywhere, like, oh, are you eating clean? Did you sin? Is that a guilty pleasure? And like, that is so messed up. And like, I've come to a point, I'm 44 years old. I have 2 kids. I love to work out. I love to wear pretty things, but I can like look in the mirror and be like, okay, look, I am 5 pounds heavier than I wanted to be. I kind of know what it takes to get rid of it. I'm either going to do it or I don't, but whether I do it or I don't doesn't mean I'm a good or a bad person. It just is another aspect of who I am. And I think being deliberate about rejecting some of that, like all of that virtue signaling around exercise is a massive step that would take us really far in the right direction.
Most definitely. I mean, it's when somebody says, you know, I'm eating clean or this is a cheat day. I once told somebody, I was like, well, what's the connotation to cheating? Like, what's the definition? It's something you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
And it like blew their mind. They had never thought about it that way. I'm like, you're literally telling yourself this language.
I know.
It's inappropriate for you to think about it this way. It's like,
guilty pleasures, sinful chocolate cake. Like, come on. And and that's, of course, when, you know, you asked me why exercise is so popular in the United States. Like we have this like very moralizing culture, right? Like to show you are virtuous is to achieve like, you know, salvation through work. And so there's something about like, I'm sweating it out on the treadmill and I'm a good person, right?
Yeah. And you're combating this especially as a professional, you're combating this information all the time. People are coming to you all the time with something they read, something they heard. And often it's just wildly inaccurate, like wildly. You're like, whoa, where'd you get that from? It's like,
well, that gets back to the expertise question, right?
Yes.
And I also think it's hard to be in like the hot seat as a fitness professional and have people come at you with so many questions that like, honestly, you might know the answer to, but in order to be teaching that HIT class or whatever, you don't need a degree that gives you the answers to all of these questions. Like I always find it funny. Like I have a PhD in history. have a fitness certification. People like come to me asking about like diet plans and like all
Yeah.
kinds of things. I'm like, I'm not that kind of doctor, you know?
Yeah.
But I think there's like a thirst for good information, but we don't exactly have systems set up in the fitness industry to provide that responsibly.
Last thing I think was interesting. It seems like, and I've studied the history of fitness a bit myself and
Mhm.
in my educational travels, and like you, we're like the same age. I have my doctorate, you have your doctorate. There's a lot of symmetry here. But it seems like in this business, it always is a pull towards the extreme in
Yep.
our business, kind of the late night salesperson, the influencer. Why do you feel like it's this extremism in fitness pulls at people so hard?
Well, there is a desire to have, miracle results, right?
Miracle.
And
There
I
you go.
think, the desire for miracle results creates a market opportunity to sell that and to fill that need, even if you can't actually fill that need, but to make these like over the top promises. One of the things I think readers will find like funny and looking back at my book is I go through like a bunch of fitness scams and like some of the things
Oh,
that people
great.
are trying to sell, the magic weight loss couch. I mean, there was like a whole huge
What?
business built around, yeah, where you would like lie on this couch and it would
Come
like
on.
shake you. Yeah, it was like every woman wants for Christmas the Stouffer's magic weight loss couch, things to make you grow taller. And I go through some of the legal cases around this. But yeah, there's a long tradition of people making fantastical promises because they can and because people will sign up for that, right? So I think there's that. Then related to the extremism point, but not scams, I think it is interesting as we think about fitness inequality and we think about like the persistent and growing problem of lack of fitness in this country. On the other end, oh my gosh, we not only have people spending more and more extreme sums of money on fitness products and retreats and studios and all of these things, but you also have like extreme fitness events and like activities that people are participating in. Like I've run 3 marathons. To me, that's like a pretty badass thing to do.
Yeah.
Now they're like normal people like me who are doing like Ironman and
Yeah.
Spartan races. And like, and I think it's so interesting the way the bar keeps being raised among a certain stratum of people, right? On the other hand, most of America doesn't exercise 20 minutes a day, right? And
Exactly.
there's the financial piece of that. But then there's also this weird cultural piece where there's like a constant raising of the bar of like, my leggings cost $200. My gym membership costs $400. I'm
Yeah.
going to do a freaking Spartan race in like Barcelona. Like,
Yeah.
it's just this whole like pushing the boundaries further and further and further that's existing on one end of the spectrum. And I think perpetuating this disparity.
Oh my goodness. That just encapsulates all of it. It really
Yeah.
does.
Right.
I mean, that's an amazing way of looking at that. It's funny for me because I was a collegiate athlete, so I don't have any pull towards all these other things. I'm like, I already did that. It's like
Yeah.
that was really hard for like 4 years. So like,
That's so interesting. So one of the other kind of big themes in here that I found so just educational to me is like looking at the difference between sports and fitness in our
yeah.
society and our history. And like there's a little bit of a personal story for me there that I was never athletic. I was so intimidated by sports and PE. And then I got really into fitness. My husband was a D1 scholarship athlete. And
Hmm.
like now he like goes to the gym to like go to the gym. But like for him, his like big thing was like, oh my God, he was a
Yeah.
D1 athlete, right? And it is really interesting at looking historically the way, like, in many ways, our culture like enshrines sport as this amazing, wonderful thing, but is very skeptical of like non-competitive fitness and like recreational
It's true.
activities, which are often more inclusive, but have a totally different cultural valence. And so the areas that comes up a lot, and I hope people find it interesting, is like looking at the Presidential Council on Fitness, where
Mm.
you have all these boosters being like, we got to get people fit and we've got to get them to participate. And they're actually almost like anti-sports because they're like, it's actually really dangerous if you have these communities with elite sports programs, because then children have spectator-itis because they just think they should be spectators and
Mm.
watch the really talented people. But we need programming that gets everyone playing kickball and, like engaged. I thought that was really interesting. But then in order to sell that, well, that's like a weird concept to a lot of people that everyone should be exercising. They recruit all of these sports celebrities like Bud Wilkinson, who was
Yeah.
like a celebrity football coach. And so there was this interesting push and pull between like, what is sport? What is fitness? How are they different? But how do they intersect also?
Yeah, that actually spectatoritis,
Yeah.
that feels like that's happening in a lot of things. I mean, it's like the basic society is becoming more of watching people text, watching people play video games, watching people work. Like everything is spectatoritis. Like,
Yes, I mean, I agree. The exact thing that I thought of was watching people play video games. Like sometimes I'll
right.
see my kids and I'm like, are you watching a YouTube
Why
of
are you
someone
watching
else?
someone play video games?
Right. But then on the other hand, I think some people would say we're at a totally different moment where like you have creators, like my 10-year-old like makes TikToks and like
Yeah.
puts them out in the world. So I don't know. I haven't, maybe the next book will be about like media culture, but the spectatoritis thing was like people were really concerned about that.
Wow, that's interesting. Natalia, this has been very enlightening. Thank you for giving me some of your time. I know you're very busy on your media tour and
You too.
everything, but please let everyone know how they could connect with your book and what you're doing.
Yeah. So the book, first of all, thank you for having me. What a pleasure to
Most
talk to you.
definitely.
My book is called Fit Nation: The Gains and Pains of America's Exercise Obsession, sold everywhere that books are sold. So you can pre-order it. It'll ship in early January. And then you can find me on Instagram, Twitter. I'm Natalia Petrzela, Natalia Petrzela. I'm not so good on LinkedIn, but you can find me on there too, and also on Facebook. So yeah, stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I really appreciate your time, and we'll be in touch
Likewise.
for sure.
Yes, that sounds great. Thank you.